Hey everyone, welcome to the first lesson of the ARM module. And in this lesson, we'll primarily discuss the anatomy of the arm, the bones and the muscles, and most of what you need to know and remember about them and some of their function. And then in the second lesson of this module, we'll go over the mannequinization and how we adapt the mannequin to make it look more anatomical and more believable. If we first look at the bones of the arm, or at least what makes up the arm, we have a couple of bones. We have 5 that are distinctive, which is the scapula. So we've talked about the scapula before in the posterior side of the torso. The scapula is this triangular shaped bone that actually has 2 parts. So one of them is this triangle part, and then the other one is this, what they call the spine, and it kind of ends in the acromion. And the acromion attaches to our clavicle at the front, and together they kind of form with the humerus that shoulder joint. So a lot of this muscles will go underneath here. The bicep muscle will go underneath here. Now, apart from the scapula, we also have the humerus. So this is the large bone of the upper arm. Then we have the ulna and radius. So our lower arm basically exists out of 2 bones. One of them makes up the elbow, right? So some of the misconception often that people think that the humerus makes up the elbow, but it's actually the ulna here that goes from the elbow to the outside of your hand or the distal side of your hand, depending on how you orientate your hand. So if you were to actually supinate your hands, it would be the medial side in this case. And so that's where the ulna ends. And then we have the radius next to that, kind of starts smaller at the elbow, at the epicondyle. So the things that stick out, what they call condyles or epicondyles, it starts thin down here, and then it thickens out towards the hand. So it makes up the majority of the wrist bone down here, and that's the radius. And then we actually have the hand. So the hand has a couple of what they call metacarpal bones, and then the phalange bones. And so the phalange bones make up the proximal phalange that is closest to your hand, the medial phalange, and then the distal phalange. And these essentially make up your fingers. Now, keep in mind that your hand is not this part with only the metacarpals. It's basically this part is what you would consider the palm of your hand, and then the rest would be fingers. So that's it for the bones of the arm. That's, to my estimate, all you need to remember is that we have the scapula, we have the humerus, we have the ulna and radius, and then we have the bones of the hand. An interesting thing to remember is that how these bones actually act, right? So when we have the humerus at the top, on the scapula side, it actually acts like a ball and socket joint, right? So this is a literal ball and socket joint. The humerus is like a ball joint that literally sockets into the scapula, and so it can virtually move in any direction. And of course, you notice from using your arms, when at the shoulder joint, you can virtually move your shoulder in any direction. When it comes to the elbow, that's a different story. It's more like a hinge joint, right? So the ulna bone literally hinges into the humerus, and it can move up and down like this, but it can also rotate like this, but it cannot overextend, right? So that's the thing. Mechanically, you cannot go like this, or you'd be in some serious trouble. And so a hinge joint kind of limits that range of motion for the arm. And when it comes to twisting, basically the hand that's performing the twisting and the ulna and the radius kind of overlap, which is something that's important to keep in mind when you think about the bones. Is when you supinate your hands, that means, like, imagine creating a bowl of soup with your hands. That's supination. So if you supinate your hands, that means your palms are facing upwards. Then the bones are next to each other. They do not overlap. If you pronate your hands, right, means you flip your hands up like this, then the radius will overlap the ulna. And now it's not as if you'll draw this at all when you're drawing human anatomy, because of course with skin applied on top, you will not really see this. However, you will see it in the muscles that are being applied on top. So the flexors and extensors that are connecting to these bones will create that quintessential ridge and overlap that you see in the arm when you pronate your hands. So that's an important piece of trivia to remember. Moving on to the deltoid, the shoulder muscle, is we can kind of recognize a couple of major muscles that make up the shoulder joint and rotator cuff, right? I've talked about the rotator cuff before. If we look at purely what you would assume is the shoulder joint, it would be the deltoid muscle, right? So this red triangular muscle. But we include the teres minor, the teres major, and the infraspinatus onto that as well. So the infraspinatus is this muscle that literally sits underneath the spine of the scapula. That's why it's called infraspinatus. Then we have the teres minor underneath that wraps around the humerus bone, and then the teres major that connects underneath. So it goes underneath the humerus bones and connects there. Right. So the teres minor goes over, teres major goes under. As you can see here, it attaches at the front. Right. So again, a lot of these muscles, of course, get overlapped by the deltoid muscle, and this is that quintessential muscle that you, of course, remember and see when we're drawing mannequins, when we're drawing figures from imagination. It's that very recognizable shape. Right, so that's essentially the shoulder joint. The only thing I think you should remember from this is the deltoid itself splits up into 3 groups. So you have the posterior, anterior, and medial side of this muscle. So it's essentially 3 muscles or muscle bundles, right? Similar to what you see with the pecs. And so again, this is a very strong muscle, right? It's not as strong as the pecs. This muscle has what they call a multi-pennant fiber arrangement. So it's arranged in such a way that it forms this feather-like pattern in the deltoid. And that patterning makes it so that it's super strong, but it does fatigue fast. If you compare that to the pecs, which have convergent muscle fibers, they can produce a lot of strain as well, but they don't fatigue as fast. But regarding the shoulder muscles, from our point of view, this is all you should remember, is that we have these 3 muscles that sit on top of the scapula, and then we have the deltoid muscle that connects both on the scapula, it connects on the spine of the scapula, on the clavicle, so it connects on the clavicle, and it connects on the spine of the scapula as well. And so that's where it attaches on top, and then it attaches on the lateral side of the humerus beneath, right? So, and if you were to look at this from a top view with the muscles, that's why we have the trapezius like this, and we would have the neck sort of wedged in between, and then we'd have the sternocleidomastoid coming up. And so we would have the clavicle running, these bike handles running up here, and then the scapula, spine of the scapula would come up here and then connect to the clavicle. And then what the deltoid does, it connects on both the clavicle and the scapula. And then it has these 3 muscle groups, essentially, which then connect to the humerus. All right. Then moving on to the arm muscles, we can see quite a few of them, and we're not going to name all of them individually. I think from our point of view, there's a couple that you should just remember. So we have at the posterior side, so the front, we have the biceps. Then here we have on the anterior side here, we have the biceps. So the anterior is the front. And on the posterior side, we have the triceps, right? So biceps and triceps will make up the large sum and volume of the upper arm. Now, we also have the brachialis and the brachioradialis, which we'll discuss in a minute. But so we have the biceps that are literally two muscle bundles. That's it. That's why it has a term biceps, right? And then triceps, same story. It has three muscle bundles. That's why it has the name triceps. And so as you can see, the bicep attaches on top of the humerus, and it also goes underneath the scapula bridge, and it connects to the scapula as well. And then it connects underneath onto the radius here, and it kind of branches off like this. Right? And so we'll have this in the video as well, where we recap this lecture, is that when you pronate or supinate your arm, your bicep literally lengthens or shortens because it's attaching to those bones of the lower arm. And then except for the biceps, oh, and this is also an interesting thing to note, is that we have the deltoid overlapping the biceps, right, like this. And then the pec will also tuck underneath that deltoid on the lateral side of the humerus. Okay, so it will literally tuck underneath. So that's why, when you feel underneath your arm on the top of your bicep and your deltoid, you will feel all those muscles coming together. And so the triceps, same story. It attaches on the top of the humerus, and it also attaches on the medial side of the scapula. And then what it does is, so it has these three muscle bundles. Right. And they stop rather abruptly at, like, let's say 2/3. And then the rest of that muscle is actually just tendon, right? Like 1/3 that attaches and overlaps the ulna. And remember, the ulna is the elbow bone, right? And so it overlaps that. And that's why you see, and you will see this in the recap as well, when you curl your arm or you bend your arm, so you're basically flexing your biceps, right? So you need your biceps to flex that arm, to curl that arm inwards. Your triceps will lengthen because if we go back to the bone, right? So your triceps will be here, like this. And so your biceps will flex. So they'll flex and shorten. And then the triceps, instead of looking like this, because it overlaps with the ulna, it will lengthen. Right? So it will really lengthen out. And you can try this yourself, right? If you straighten your arm or you flex your arm, those triceps will shorten and lengthen. And that's part of because what the elbow joint is doing. All right. So same story here. We have those muscles of the deltoid of the shoulder, the infraspinatus, the teres major, teres minor, and the deltoid that will overlap that tricep muscle. So the tricep muscle and the bicep muscle will tuck underneath that deltoid. From the side, what you can see, so if you rotate your arm and you would see on the inside of it, so on the medial side, you can see that very clearly, right? That we have the bicep anteriorly and we have the tricep posteriorly. And then in between that sits what we call the brachialis, right? So that's this muscle. And the main function of the brachialis is to help support the elbow, and so the biceps, with flexing the lower arm, right? So with flexing it this way. So that's what the brachialis does. It's a smaller muscle, and as you can see, what it does is it wedges in between the biceps and triceps here. And on some very lean arms, so people that are, have low fat reserves, you will definitely see this muscle poke out a little bit. Now, if you have a little bit more fat percentage-wise, you'll probably not see this muscle as clearly. And what it does is it attaches on the it actually attaches on the other side, so on the distal side of the humerus. So if we look at the arm from the front, that brachialis muscle here actually connects on this side of the humerus bone that sits underneath here. Okay, so keep that in mind. And it then connects to the ulna underneath. So the ulna bone, the bone that makes up your elbow, that's where it connects. Then if we move on to the lower arm, we can essentially again see three major muscle groups. We purposely did not separate all of the muscles of the lower arm because in our point of view, it's not that important to remember this by heart. If you want to, be our guest, but we're just going to identify three superficial muscle groups. The first being the brachioradialis. So don't confuse it with the brachialis. It's the brachioradialis. And the name actually kind of reveals itself. What separates it from the brachialis is that the brachioradialis connects to the radius bone instead of the ulna, and also attaches on the lateral side of the humerus. Again, this is also a flexor and kind of has this drumstick shape, similar to the extensor group, actually. So we have the flexor group the flexor muscle that is the brachioradialis here, and then we have another flexor group on the medial side, so this group in green. And so what these muscles do is they help flex the hand and the fingers. And what the extensor group does, this one indicated in purple, is it helps extend the fingers, right? So if you put your arm forward and you raise your hand upward as if you were to, stop something, this is what that muscle group does. From our point of view, that's all you should remember, is that we have these three muscle groups that make up the entirety of the lower arm. And we group this together for the purpose of this course because this suffices for imaginary drawing. The extensor group is responsible for extending the fingers and wrists, while the flexor group is responsible for flexing the fingers and wrists, right? They also help in stabilizing the elbow joint, of course, but their primary function is flexion and extension. Now, if we then quickly go look at some form, and this is where it gets interesting. We'll look at this in the arm simplification video as well, but we want you to already keep this in mind, is that when we combine some of these muscles in a strategic way, we can group them in such a way that it becomes easier to remember them and also think about how they wedge together and what their rhythm might be. And you can clearly see this if we look at this simplified form that is actually derived, and a little bit of a simplification from Bridgman, is that we can clearly see the simplification for the deltoid muscle, right? So it's almost a box, a little bit manipulated in its form and edges, but essentially it's still a box. And then we group the triceps and bicep and of course brachialis muscle together as well to form this rather flat box oriented in a different way compared to the deltoid, right? And we group them together like this. And then we have that extensor and flexor group that we also group together. So we have the brachioradialis and we have that other flexor group on the other side. And when we get into the wrist bone, we actually get a little bit more squarish because this is where the ulna and the radius come together. So again, we get this flattened box in a different orientation. And so when you pay attention to this, what it actually looks like is a chain interlocking. And I'm sure you've heard of this before, but we can consider the arm as being a chain that kind of interlocks like this, right? So it'd be the deltoid. This would be from a side view. It would be the deltoid, and then the biceps and triceps, and then the extensor groups again, flexor groups again, and then the last part of the lower arm, which is more the bony part. So this would be like this. This would be this. But if you can think about it like that, it will already become a little bit easier for you to grasp the simplification of the arm itself. As you can see, if you take that a little bit more, if you take that a little bit further and you're a little bit more aware about your shape manipulation, as you can see what Lex did here, you can break it down individually a little bit more to better represent the muscles that actually sit underneath. Because of course, our muscles do not look like this, right? They're a little bit more organic. They're a little bit carved out more. They're a little bit more, or specific. But if you know their form, right, you can use that simplification and create something that looks like this, what you see here done by Axel. And the interesting thing about these things is if you can draw it in these interlocking ways, when you look at the shaded version, let's say, let's call it the realistic version, you can see that the shadow side of this arm still corresponds with the planes that we have here. So if we have the planes that, if we have this shadow map like this, we can still see that most of that still corresponds with the real life version of that arm. And so that's why it's so interesting to memorize these simplified forms and get a better grasp on how to mannequinize those complex forms instead of always remembering, the super complex shapes. Because if you simplify it, you can still represent something very believable, and it will become a lot easier for you to render things from imagination, because all you would need to consider is the simple form, how light would hit that simple form, and what the resulting shadow would be, or instead of overcomplicating things. All right, here at least, welcome to lesson 1 of the arm module. This lesson will be focusing on the anatomy of the arms and how they interlock with their simplified forms. When we look at the bones of the arms, we can identify 5 distinct bones. Again, we will see the scapula, since various muscles of the arms will attach to this bone. Next, we have the humerus, a thick bone that sockets into the scapula and clavicle to form what you know as the shoulder socket. Then the lower arm has 2 bones. The ulna, the bone that makes up your elbow and connects to the pinky side of your hand bones. And lastly, the radius, the bone that crosses the ulna when we internally rotate or pronate our hand. Then lastly, we have the bones of the hands, which we'll cover in more depth in the next lesson. Mechanically, the arm bones work as a hinge joint. So the ulna wedges into the humerus to hinge the arm inward, but prevents it from overextending. And as discussed, the radius will cross over the ulna when internally rotating. This will be important to understand, as this is what makes the extensor muscles of the lower arm give us that specific shape when the arm is internally rotating. Proportionally, the humerus is equal in length to the radius and ulna. And interestingly, the hand seems equal in side as the distance from the base of your shoulder to the crease of your elbow. Moving on to the muscles, we'll start by examining the muscles that make up the shoulder and rotator cuff. From the back, we can see the scapula is covered, at least superficially, by the infraspinatus, the teres minor, and the teres major. Then these muscles are covered partially by the deltoid muscle, a large bundle of muscles that attaches on both the scapula, the clavicle, and the humerus. This muscle has what they call a multi-pennate fiber arrangement. This means the muscle fibers are arranged in a feather-like pattern, which allows them to output huge force, but they tire easily. Compare that to the pec major, which has convergent muscle fibers, and it can produce even more force without tiring too fast. From the front, the deltoid muscle will be similar in shape to the back. The teres major is slightly visible anatomically from this view as well. Of course, when it's covered with skin, it is not. The teres major works in synergy with the latissimus dorsi to extend, adduct, and internally rotate the humerus bone. Moving on to the upper arm, we can identify 3 major superficial muscles. We have the biceps on the front or anterior side of the arm, It's a large muscle with two muscle groups, hence the term biceps, that attaches on both the humerus and the scapula and the radius. This is why when you internally rotate or pronate your hand, your bicep becomes elongated. On the posterior side of the humerus, we'll find the triceps, an even larger muscle that, as you could have guessed, has three muscle groups. The top of the triceps attaches to the top of the humerus and the inside of the scapula, and at the bottom attached to the ulna. This is why when you flex your arm, the tricep extends, since you are moving the ulna bone further away from the humerus as it hinges. Then on the medial side or inner side of the arm, a small muscle called the brachialis wedges in between the biceps and triceps. This tiny muscle actually attaches on the distal side of the humerus and connects to the ulna. When we look at the lower arm, we can identify another three superficial muscle groups. The brachioradialis, which also starts on the distal side of the humerus, connects to the radius bone and is, along with the flexor group muscles, the main reason for that distinct drumstick shape of the arm. Next to the brachioradialis sits the extensor group muscles. Now, we group these muscles together for the purpose of this course. As to our belief, this suffices for the purpose of imaginary drawing. The extensor muscle group is responsible for extending the fingers and wrists, while the flexor group is responsible for flexing the fingers and wrists. To practice this, we want you to do the following assignments. We want you to trace over 10 of the images we provide in this lesson, clearly indicating where the muscles sit on the body, and again, what their volume is. Secondly, you will add the muscles as discussed in this lesson on top of 3 skeletal images provided in the resources. It is important that you do this from imagination to see if you are aware of the muscle placement and their form. Lastly, you will draw the interlocking form variations of your 3 arm poses to show you understand the relation between the deltoid, upper, and lower arm. Alright? That's it, Artleets. We hope you have fun, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.